Ho ho ho, Merry Christmas, or as soulless corporate suits who don't want to offend anybody would say, Happy Holidays. And yes, before you ask, this really is a Christmas hat that I made in Microsoft Paint that I have poorly edited on my head because I have absolutely no idea where I put my real one. So, yeah. You know, back in the day, we all thought that Christmas was all about receiving gifts, right? But with some life experience, we all realise that the real joy of Christmas is not receiving gifts, but giving them away. And thus, ladies and gentlemen, you can consider this my gift to you. Drumroll please. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you a brief history of snow in video games. Now I know what you're thinking. Seriously, a history lesson on virtual snow in video games? Boring! But actually, I think you'll find this to be much more interesting than it originally seems. We're going to look at 8 games spanning across 4 different decades, and we're going to start in none other than the 1980s. Ah yes, the 80s, a decade renowned for its great tunes, bizarre clothing, and perhaps most importantly of all, aesthetic. A decade of badasses, where anything went and no fucks were given. A decade that I missed. And instead I have to spend my 20s here, in the 20s. I fucking hate you people. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows in the 80s, however, as sadly video games were still quite a novel concept. And to prove this, we begin our journey all the way back in 1982 with a little known game called Horus Goes Skiing. I suppose it wouldn't be a game from the 80s if it didn't blast your eardrums with chiptunes and give you an epileptic fit. I feel like I've just entered the DMT realm. The game starts off with you playing as a monster munch with legs, crossing a busy motorway in order to get some skis. Pretty standard stuff. If you manage to survive not being ran over, the actual game begins and, wow, what a beauty it is. Not really, it looks like absolute arse. The so-called snow is quite literally just a plain white texture. In fact, it looks so bad that I was unironically able to make a better looking version of it in Microsoft Paint. I mean, be honest with me, if I said this was Horus Goes Skating 2, you'd probably be like, yeah, that checks out. But you know folks, it's easy to look back on this game and laugh at how primitive it looks, without taking into consideration that this game is more than a decade older than me. I mean, give the game some slack here. It came out over a decade before even Windows 95 came out, and we use that today when joking about ancient software. If Windows 95 is considered ancient, then this is borderline prehistoric. So no, despite its horrible graphics, I respect you, Horus Goes Skiing. For real though, it actually does look quite fun. Maybe I'll give it a fucking hell. Believe it or not, you can actually buy Horus Goes Skating on Steam. I mean, why you'd want to is another story, but hey. Fast forward a few years to 1985, and we have a game simply titled Winter Games, based of course on the Winter Olympics. As you can see, you can pick your country, whether it be the UK, USA, and yes, this game is so old, you can actually even select the USSR, as that country would still exist for another 6 years. You can even be the country of Epics, which just so happens to also be the name of the developers. Why did the developers make their own country? Fuck knows, but hey, why not? I for one want a House Hexagon country as soon as possible. And this menu is actually pretty cool, as depending on what country you select, a chiptune of the national anthem will play. Take Snowy Britain here for example. It's the small details like this that show a game was made with some soul. Anyway, as you can see, it looks way better than Horus Goes Skiing, but that's like saying that you have better lips than Pete Burns. The game still looks like the arsehole of someone with diarrhea after they've ate too many Milky Bars, but an improvement is an improvement, I suppose. It kind of looks like a Bob Ross painting, if I was Bob Ross. Skiing isn't all you can do in this game, however. There is a wide array of activities available. For example, check out this figure skating. Look at those moves. It even comes with its own tune. Listen to this. I don't know about you, but that's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. It's a 10 from me. It's also worth noting how there's a fake shadow effect that was added to the sprite here to give it the illusion of lighting and depth. Quite advanced for its time. Sadly, it seems the developers must have spent all their budget on it, as in other parts of the game, such as speed skating, they seem to have given up in the art department. It looks like these guys have all shit themselves and are now all running to the nearest bathroom, for some reason, in between random lines of cocaine. But by far the most interesting part of this game is the so-called bobsleigh. Apart from the UI here being an absolute disaster, with the map taking up more of the screen than the actual game itself, it's interesting because this was long before 3D games ever became the norm. And though this is blatantly not 3D, it's interesting to see that even in the mid-1980s, developers were still experimenting with such concepts. And now onto a decade where I did at least exist, the glorious 1990s, starting with a relatively unknown game that came out in 1991, called CJs Elephant Adventures. So this game is interesting because it's right on the tail end of when games started to transition away from being two-dimensional to being three-dimensional. It's also when games started to turn from being arcadey into being more of a narrative experience. You know it's a game from the 90s when graphics is spelled with an X. The game starts off explaining the story. Somewhere over France, CJ the elephant, stolen from his family in Africa, is on his way to a secret zoo somewhere in England, until all of a sudden, turbulence rocks the plane and CJ's cage bursts open. Grabbing a nearby umbrella, CJ heads for the door and leaps out. And that's about as far as the story goes, a truly riveting tale. There's 4 levels in total: France, Switzerland, Egypt, and then Africa. Which, you know, kind of makes no sense considering Egypt is in Africa, but, you know, whatever. In fact, you know what? Not whatever. Look at this map. Egypt is clearly a part of Africa. Why does it seem like only I know this? You guys can program a game, but you don't even know Egypt is in Africa? Stupid Americans. They never know geography, do they? Wait, what? The game's British. British. Cut that out. Cut that out. The snowy level takes place in Switzerland, and yeah, despite it being 6 years later, there's barely any noticeable improvement from winter games in terms of graphics. You know, maybe this was a bad example to use after all. But hey, the game essentially revolves around you shooting the shit out of snowmen in hats and bombing obese penguins, so at least there's that. Can't quite figure out why there's trees that are upside down though. Gravity must have worked differently in the 90s. On to 1996, we have the smash hit Super Mario 64. Now of course those of you who haven't been living under a rock will know that I've included this because it was one of the first mass commercially available true 3D games on the first mass commercially available true 3D console. But was it really? Super Mario 64 is fascinating to look at, not just because of the giant leap forward it took, but because of the hardware limitations it was under. You see, the Nintendo 64 had 2 main aims that were at odds with each other. One, it had to push 3D graphics at a time when having such was a relatively novel concept. 2, at the same time be affordable so people could actually buy it. As a result, Nintendo had to cut a lot of corners in order for the game to even run properly, and one of the ways they did this was via a graphical technique called billboarding. Billboarding is when a 2D texture constantly rotates to face the camera from the same angle as to give the illusion of having the same depth as a 3D object, without actually being 3-dimensional. For example, take this artwork of me. Clearly, this is 2D, a completely flat image. If you were to move 90 degrees to the side, from that perspective, it would look like this, a totally flat line. Obviously, this isn't great. But if this image was billboarded, it wouldn't matter what angle you viewed it from, as it would always be facing you. Super Mario 64 uses billboarding in so many ways, its trees perhaps being the most obvious example. If you focus on the trees in the back there, you'll notice that as Mario slides past and the camera angle shifts, the trees remain in the exact same place. The effect is even more obvious up close as shown here. It's quite fascinating to see the lengths that developers had to go through to even run just slightly 3D games on such limited hardware. What's even more fascinating, however, is that despite such clever techniques, the game only ran at a resolution of 320 by 240, at around 20 frames a second. For reference, my current setup tends to run games at 2560 by 1440 at 144 frames a second. That's roughly 8 times less pixels and 7 times less frames. And that, ladies and gentlemen, goes to prove that great gameplay will always triumph over great hardware. Great gameplay, such as ruthlessly kicking penguins off of cliffs to their deaths. Onwards to the decade that changed everything, the 2000s. It's also the decade where people stopped dressing like fucking idiots, so... damn it, I have to take these shades off. Hi. We're going to start with a banger. 2003's Elder Scrolls III Morrowind Blood Moon. Yes, though the original Morrowind base game did come out in 2002, as those who have played it will be aware, there was no snow present in the mushroom-filled hellhole known as Vardenfell whatsoever. However, a year later, with the highly acclaimed Blood Moon expansion, an entire new island of snow, Solstheim, was made available. By this point, hardware had finally caught up to developer ambition, and techniques like billboarding became a relic of the past. Now, games were capable of rendering a full-fat 3D experience without compromise, or requiring intensely high-end hardware. I mean, make no mistake, it's still not exactly a work of art, but for the first time ever, games could actually be considered somewhat, unironically, good looking. Alright, the 2000s. I need another game to talk about. Let me think. Oh yeah. 2004's smash hit World of Warcraft had many zones across its 2 continents at launch, but only 3 of them were actually snowy. This all changed in 2008 with the release of the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, which introduced an entire continent that had a more Arctic climate. The only reason I mention World of Warcraft, apart from the fact I never shut the fuck up about it, is because of its unusual dynamic weather system. In patch 1.10, dynamic weather was added to the game, meaning that at random times it could start to rain or perhaps get cloudy, etc. It wasn't until Wrath of the Lich King that such weather effects would really get a chance to shine, however, with its heavily featured snowstorms, for example. The way the weather works is actually quite fascinating. In the words of Jeff Kaplan, each subzone where weather is currently available is linked to a set of variables that allows the possibility of precipitation. The variables have been set to make the potential weather appropriate, meaning heavy showers are more likely in one region and drizzles in another. The zone is practically asking itself whether there will be weather. It's sort of randomly picking, I'm ready to rain, but do I want to rain? Duration will be chosen based on an automated system as well, with enough variables to make things unpredictable. We didn't want it to be such a mathematical formula that somebody could literally sit with a stopwatch, log in, go to a zone and go, okay, in 2, 1, go, it's going to rain. Games had not only started to become truly three-dimensional, but now started to incorporate advanced systems into making these worlds actually feel like worlds, rather than mere code that can be predicted. And lastly, onto the dreaded 2010s, or as I shall call it, the decade where gaming died. Starting with 2012's Assassin's Creed III, a game which cover portrays what looks like a Brazilian male prostitute beating the shit out of a British royal guard. Or, as we would call it, an average night in Blackpool. This game featured snow quite heavily and, as you can see, still looks quite impressive even to this day. You can see that by this point, hardware-intensive operations such as real-time rendered shadows, once only achieved by being clever, are now effortlessly delivered. However, the realism isn't quite fully achieved yet. Though the game looks passable on first glance, upon further inspection, you can see that details such as prints on the floor are absent, as well as any real ability to meaningfully impact the actual world around you outside of the game's main mechanics. But hey, at least you can stab the shit out of a bunny. And now we shall end on a game that I believe is the ultimate spectacle of snow in a video game. I am of course talking about 2018's Red Dead Redemption 2. In all my time playing games, I have never been one to gawk over graphics, being much more of a story-orientated person. However, when I played this, I couldn't help but be blown away by the sheer realism it provided. You can see on the ground that as you move, the snow clears out just as it would in reality, and when you move away a vast distance, you can even look back and see the trail you've made. I mean, it's just absolutely stunning. What's even more mind-boggling is that effects such as this were possible on hardware that came out all the way in 2013, such as the baseline PS4 that I played it on. What you're seeing here is, if you can believe it, technically considered a last-generation game. And I suppose that's the fundamental point of this entire production, to showcase just how fast we have advanced technologically as a species. In many ways the world is terrible today. World governments are all run by psychopaths, corporations have way too much power over our lives, and let's be honest, the average person today is, well, a fucking moron. However, all of us today are in a way quite fortunate to be alive right now, to witness firsthand our species' unrivaled and ingenious developments in the world of technology. No other generation in human history will ever be able to experience watching such massive advancements as ours has. It's estimated that humans have been around for 200,000 years, with recorded history spanning for only around 4,000 years of that. The average human lifespan today is a mere 75 years, and despite this we've managed to go from this to this in the space of just 40 years, just over half a lifetime. Which begs the question, what will the world of gaming look like in another 40 years from now? Will games look indistinguishable from reality? If so, wouldn't that then send us into a philosophical frenzy of nihilism, whereby our generation's greatest minds will start to ponder and then accept the fact we live in a simulation, just like the ones we have created, whereby most people are in fact just NPCs, pre-programmed to think and act a certain way, and that this, all of this, is just one big game, and very few of us are actual players. Merry Christmas!